series on global conflict in collaboration with IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center IWON and Political Science Secretariat POSA IIUM. So before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. So first of all, today's webinar is being recorded and is going on a live stream on POSA IIUM Facebook. So we will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you as well to revisit the content yourself and share it with your friends and colleagues. Secondly, we also invite your comments and questions after Javier has finished his presentation. So please look at the chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, uh, Mr. Javier is going to address later on in the Q&A session after the presentation. So third of all, a reminder for participants to kindly fill in the form through the link provided in the chat box by our committee members for your attendance, and also we would appreciate if you could give us feedback on this event. So before we move on, I would like to first invite our respected advisor, Dr. Mio Alif, Head of Advocacy and Consultancy at IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center and Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science, IIUM, for his opening remark. Please be welcome.
Assalamualaikum. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to those of you tuning in from Kuala Lumpur. And of course, good morning, right, to our distinguished, there's no other word for it, speaker, Mr. Javier Castrillon, who's joining us from, I guess, from the past, right? Because I believe it's very early in the morning in Colombia. It's yesterday for you.
It is 7:30 a.m.
Yeah, I believe it's very early. So we thank him. Thank you, Javier, for your commitment, of course, and your willingness to accommodate the time difference. This is how it has to be these days. Hopefully things will be better, but again, thank you very much for your presence and for your willingness to accommodate the situation we have tonight. But for everyone else, welcome to the third installment. This is the third installment of this webinar series on global conflict, WSGC. Some of them call it the webinar series on global conflict. I am, of course, the program manager, advisor, again, selfish of me, advising, right? Tonight I'm advising, but the running, of course, and the organizing of all the things we've had so far, because it is a series, of course. This series is really a result of the fruits of labor of the conflict circle. Individuals like Izzuddin, Majid, and those behind the scene, Farah, Milza, and so on. So the conflict circle they're all here, they're present tonight as well. And the series is of course a result of the efforts of members of the conflict circle, being the lead organizer of the series, right? And of course, in collaboration with IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center, and of course, not forgetting the Secretariat for Political Science, the Political Science Student Association, POSA, at IIUM. Of course, I congratulate the efforts in collaboration between these three distinguished organizations. And of course, hopefully, there'll be more, right? It's really a feat to my mind to be able to not only host, but also secure the participation of distinguished and of course very experienced speakers such as Javier. We had in the first installment we spoke to Dr. Robert Thompson, and in the second installment we were speaking to Ms. Munira. These were excellent individuals, and today we have another one, Javier, within the same bracket as well. And of course, without further ado, I think I'll pass the floor back to Izzuddin to brief you about the area of discussion and our speaker today. But of course, the short and long of it is well, we'll hear from Colombia and further. Thank you, Javier. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks to you guys. Yeah. It is a pleasure to be with you. So are we ready to start? Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So before that, thank you so much, Dr. Mio Alif. So before we give the floor to Mr. Javier himself, I would like to briefly introduce our respected presenter, Mr. Javier Castrillon. So he is an advisor and analyst in the defense and security sectors with regional expertise in assessing political and security developments in Colombia, the country's relation with Venezuela and other neighbors, and more broadly, the hemispheric and extra-hemispheric influences on Latin America. So Javier Castrillon has experience with the Colombian Air Force and is the holder of an Master in Theory and History of International Relations from the London School of Economics. He has published multiple works on the Cold War in Colombia, Colombian-US military cooperation, the Colombian conflict at the border with Venezuela, as well as security sector reform of the Colombian military forces. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Javier Castrillon himself. So without further ado, please be welcome.
Okay, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be with you guys sharing this wonderful conversation and seminars. And okay, I'm gonna talk about today about the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the recent fall of the oldest insurgency, the Western Hemisphere. Next one, please. Can you hear me? Next, please. Okay, I'm gonna still talking about the human cause of the Colombian conflict. This is the first thing that I want to let you know. And right now, we have more than 8,550,000 victims because the conflict, unfortunately, has not stopped. Just stopped with the FARC, but we're still having a conflict with the ELN and drug traffickers in the jungle. This figure it is done with the help of the Unit for the Victims Assistance and Reparation, which is a governmental department. And these victims are counted about homicide, internal displacement, disappearance, landmine and unexploded ammunition victims, as well as victims for recruitment. And the FARC was one of the main armed organizations culprit of this figure, along with the ELN. As I told you, we're still having a conflict with them, with the Popular Liberation Army, and also the paramilitary forces that were allied with some parts of the Colombian government and the army. And the conflict with them ended in 2006 after a peace negotiation with them. Next one, please. We're gonna start this conversation by showing how is the division of this. I divided this in 4 stages. The first stage, guerrilla marginality and social legitimacy, which is the starting period of the FARC. Second stage, military consolidation and presence in Coca regions. The third stage, which I call El Caguan dialogues, and the political military decline. And all this because counterinsurgency strategy, a new counterinsurgency strategy that we developed thanks to the military cooperation with the United States. And a fourth stage, which I call decline, new peace talks, which were the peace talk of La Habana, and the demobilization of the organization indeed. Next one, please. And the first stage, as I told you, guerrilla marginality and social legitimacy, the founding of the FARC, and you have in the picture Manuel Marulanda Vélez, which was the founder of the FARC, a mythical guerrilla figure, and I think the oldest guerrilla figure in the war before his death in an operation, a military operation. And he said, we have to give the land to those who need it and want to work it through the way that oligarchs allow us. Let's see what is it, if it's a political or the other. And by the other, he meant violence, and huge violence indeed. Next one, please. How did it start everything? The first stage, and we're still having some of those issues in Colombia, are structural issues, really difficult problems for Colombia. Inequality, poverty, concentration of power, abusive condition for peasants, and lack of power distribution. And Colombia in the whole territory, it has 114 million hectares. From those hectares, 42 million hectares are suitable for agriculture, but those hectares are really high concentrated in a few hands. 80% of that land is in the hands of 40% landowners. So try to imagine the grade of the grade of inequality in land distribution in Colombia. The rest of that land, 20%, is in the hands of 86% of rural population, and most of them in that time were poor and are still being poor right now. So Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So this is a quite nice ground for the growing of revolutionary movements, and they grew in areas of social demands. Okay, next one, please. So how did the elites defended that status? The status quo was defended by violence, state violence at the beginning, and defended that the status quo was bloody indeed. And it was tangible in a civil strife that erupted with the murder of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. In the picture, you have Jorge Eliezer Gaitan and a quite nice image of what did happen after the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, and that even we call it El Bogotazo. Who was Jorge Eliezer Gaitan? He was a populist liberal leader educated in Italy, but he defended the poor and rural interests, and that's why he was really important for that huge part of the population that was suffering inequality and poverty in rural areas. He was killed, ironically, by a fanatic with no political affiliation at all. And I said this because by that time, Colombia was divided. Society was divided between liberal and conservatives. Here we have some newspapers of that time. We said Bogota is semi-destroyed, and the other one that said this was a communist coup, but it wasn't indeed a communist coup. That was a conservative newspaper, and also the United States by that time called El Bogotazo a communist coup because George Marshall was by that time, the 9th of April of 1948, in Bogota, because they were celebrating a meeting of the American Organization of States here in Colombia, and it was an excellent opportunity for them to talk about a communist threat in the continent in that. But indeed, it was the explosion of structural issues in Colombia, in the Colombian society. The conclusion of that period of violence with El Bogotazo, we call it the violencia or la violencia, a period that lasted 10 years from 1948 to 1958. And it was a civil strife in all its words. We had during 10 years, 200,000 dead people massacred by each party, and each party organized self-defense forces, liberal and conservative. The conservatives were helped by the government, the military forces, and the police, while the liberals, they allied with the communists and armed themselves to defend their land and defend their life. Next one, please. La violencia ended in 1958, as I told you, with more power concentration for elites, political elites, conservatives, and liberal elites. They agreed to impose a dictatorship to bring peace to the country, which was commanded by a military board. And that military board was led by General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. He was from the army, and it was the only dictatorship that we had in the 20th century in Colombia. And it was a short dictatorship. It lasted just 4 years indeed. He gave amnesties to conservative and liberal art movements and imposed some degree of stability in urban and rural areas of Colombia. After that, both parties ousted General Rojas Pinilla because they wanted to have the power, the political power for them. Rojas Pinilla wanted to continue in the power, but both parties organized his ousted, and they organized a system of power, of sharing the power between both parties, which was called the Frente Nacional. This restricted the access to state power for alternative movements such as the communists. The Frente Nacional, the National Front Agreement, lasted from 1958 to 1974, and it was due to that restricted mechanism to sharing power that the guerrillas born. They born mainly in the year of 1964. It was born the M19, the ELN, and the FARC-EP as we saw it, as we knew it as a terrorist group. And on the top of that, the National Front attacked dissidents movements, such as the communist and liberal communities. After the violencia, the communist and liberal movements, the peasant movements indeed, aligned with those ideologies, organized small communities with self-government. They were 7 communities, as you can see them in the map on your right, which they call themselves El Pato Guayabero, Río Chiquito, Marquetalia, El Duda, El Alto Sumapaz, y Alto Ariay. However, as I told you, we were in the Cold War, and the United States was really concerned about these independent movements in the continent, and for them there was all a communist threat. So that's why they organized, along with the Colombian government, a Marquetalia operation, which was carried out with the invasion of those places and the bombing of those places with the help of the United States. A small number of peasants, according to the history of FARC, it was about 40 to 50 peasants. They make it to escape. They escaped to the south of the country and founded the Southern Bloc, which was the initial organization of the FARC. Okay, next one, please. What was happening in the region by that time? There was the Cold War, as I told you, which was a source of financial resources and ideologies. 2 ideologies, the internal enemy doctrine that used to practice rightist government in the continent, and a communist ideology which was practiced by the guerrilla movement. But there was a different kind of communist movements, because we had as well the Cuban Revolution that got power in 1959, and they used to practice another kind of a strategy different to the communist one of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union believed to act through the parties, through the Communist Party. Anyway, they supported some guerrillas, but the party had the preference for them, while the Cubans had the guerrilla preference indeed, and they used to practice something that they called the FOCO group. So they introduced a group of men inside the country and founded a guerrilla, and that was the strategy that they used with the ELN in Colombia, and also in Bolivia with the Che Guevara, and he died there practicing that strategy. And later we had as well the Sandinista revolution, which is still in power in Nicaragua. Those events served to inspire the guerrillas in the continent, and even more in Colombia. This inspired the emergence of Latin American guerrillas in the whole continent, even in Argentina, in Uruguay, and in Central America as well, in El Salvador, and in Guatemala as well. But for example, the guerrillas in Argentina, Uruguay, and some in Colombia, which like the M19, they were urban guerrillas, different from the Colombian guerrilla of the FARC guerrilla. Indeed, the FARC guerrilla is a peasant guerrilla. And as well, we had the dictatorship supported by the US that contained the advancement of guerrilla, but also committed crimes against population with fairly and just democratic demands indeed. This gave inspiration, as I told you, to the FARC, as well as resources amid popular disagreement and demonstrations. Next one, please. So from the first stage to the second stage, we have the deployment of the FARC, of the Southern Bloc, and after they changed their name to the revolutionary, to the army, well, to the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias of Colombia, the FARC, the revolutionary movement that cope all the country and that deployed to the whole country. That's how the guerrilla expanded to the whole country. First, in the Central Cordillera to the north, and also to the east and west. But they grew according to the Coca region areas, and also according to those areas where the state was not making integral presence there. And by integral presence, I mean public services, education, health, clean water, energy, and security indeed. So they became an army with a doctrine, clear objectives, a hierarchy and organization indeed, even with popular intelligence networks and huge financial resources. What was it? What was it their model indeed? As a terrorist and military organization, they adopted a war model that combined people war with insurgency. Insurgency, I mean insurrection indeed, in cities and small towns, and adopted a central demand. Rural reform, which is similar to land reform. As I told you, Colombia, and it is still being like that, it has a huge concentration of land. And if you see the Gini concentration index, Colombia, it has right now 0.8, which is quite high. When you are closer to one, it means that the country has a huge inequality in it. So during this time, there were two attempts of negotiation, you can see. The first one was with Belisario Betancourt in 1984. They tried to set up a political movement that supposed to help them to do that transition to the political fight in it over the military one, which they call the Patriotic Union. And this movement was aligned and allied with other leftist movement, peaceful movements in Colombia. However, they suffered the repression and murder by the state, and not just the state, but also paramilitary movements, because in that period of the Cold War, any movement with fair demands was seen as a communist threat and communist influence of the Soviet Union, or not the Soviet Union, but also the Cuban Revolution. So after that, there were another attempt of negotiation, which is with Virgilio Barco Vargas in that government at the end of the government, and with Cesar Gaviria at the beginning of that government. And that negotiation was quite interesting because opened the democratic path for other groups through a new constitution. So that negotiation was with the M19 guerrilla. As I told you, that was a urban guerrilla. The Quintin Lame, which was an indigenous guerrilla from the Department of Cauca, and also with the revolutionary movement of the workers. However, the FARC and the ELN, they were not agree with different parts of the negotiation because they wanted to change the whole structure of the system and nationalize different minerals and resources of energy of Colombia. But the government and the elites were not agree with that. So they remain in illegality, and they started to grow and develop their military strategic plan. Next one, please. The negotiation ended with a quite tragic event. The government bombed again the FARC in their safe haven that they used to call Casa Verde, or the greenhouse in La Uribe Meta. That was in 1991, just when the new constitution was being signed. The government was bombing them in La Uribe Meta in Casa Verde. So how did the FARC proceed after that failed negotiation? They became an offensive guerrilla. And this is a second stage A second stage of military consolidation and presence in Coca regions. This was tangible in the application of its 7th conference. The FARC had 10 conferences. The 7th one was celebrated in 1982, and it was the most important one because it set the strategic plan for them. The 7th conference aimed at controlling coca growing regions as a source of finance for them and as a way to defend the peasants that used to grow the coca in those regions against the drug traffickers. Also, they wanted to gain more financial resources, not just through the coca, but also through the kidnapping for ransom and kidnapping for political interest, and also through extortion of businesses and multinationals in Colombia. They built up their military capabilities with those resources. They expanded its operations to the entire country. They wanted to isolate the capital and main cities and multiply their combatants, and they indeed did it. They multiplied their combatants in a huge way. We will see it later. They grew to, in 1998, to 20,000 combatants. So try to imagine a guerrilla with 20,000 combatants in the whole country fighting against the state. That was a huge challenge for Colombia. And we were called by the United States a failed country. So they developed large scale operations and promoted a general uprising with the urban support network because they had not just the military combatants, but they had also intelligence networks in the city to try to develop a plan of insurrection. They even founded the clandestine Communist Party of Colombia to help to develop the ideological strategy of insurrection in the cities and even more in rural regions. FARC grew to more than 20,000 combatants, as I told you, due to trafficking, kidnapping for ransom, extortion to society, extortion to business, extortion to multinationals. And from 1998 to 2002, their revenues per year were really high. They got 1.2 billion US dollars per year. That was a quite huge quantity that allowed them to concentrate forces and guns. The number of people kidnapped by 1998 grew to 1,200 people among militaries, political leaders, even regular Colombian citizens, because they used to go to the highways, interregional highways, and kidnap people. Even American citizens were kidnapped by them. Next one, please. So we have here a small table, the main attacks of the guerrilla during the period of 1996 to 1998. The biggest guerrillas offensive were done in this period. There were cases of 500 or even 1,200 guerrilla combatants attacking towns and military bases. In most of them, they took prisoners, being Miraflores and Mitu, the worst cases. In Miraflores, they took 129 members of the military forces as prisoners for them. In the latter, in Mitu, air operations were vital to retake control of the city, since it was attacked by more than 1,000 guerrilla fighters. Prisoners took during these attacks lasted more than 10 years, kidnapped in places similar to concentration camps. You can see in the picture of the bottom right. In places similar to concentration camps in the jungle, you can imagine people cannot survive sometimes. So others escaped, others were part of humanitarian interchange for guerrilla combatants in prisons of the state, and some others were rescued by the military forces. So this was quite a difficult period of Colombia, and that's why you can see the word called Colombia a failed state, because there was a huge threat, a real threat, that the FARC was able to seize power. Next one, please. So what was the state answer? And the state answer was based as well on the FARC loss of legitimacy and moral leadership among public opinion due to these terrorist attempts and due to their link with the drug trafficking business. And Colombia, as I told you, was seen as a failed state. So that's when the government of Andrés Pastrana opened the door of dialogues with them. And he opened it by demilitarizing an area of 42,000 kilometers square, which you can see in the map. The gray zone, which was called the FARC zone or El Caguán. This was a demilitarized zone formed by San Vicente del Caguán, La Uribe, Mesetas, La Macarena, and Vista Hermosa. All of them zones between the departments of Meta and Caquetá in the south of the country. It was a demilitarized zone. And while negotiating amid the conflict, the FARC used this zone to attack in neighboring areas and make wider this zone, this demilitarized zone, while the government was trying to build up its military to face that threat. There were even members of international terrorist organizations visiting FARC in El Caguán. Members of the Irish Republican Army, for example, or Hezbollah as well. El Caguán was serving as a zone to hide people kidnapped and was serving as a zone as well to negotiate arms and drugs. There were even cases of arms being parachuted from planes. So it was a zone outside of the legal order of the state indeed. When the dialogues ended after 4 years, given regular violence of the FARC, which included an aircraft hijacking, Pastrana ordered to retake the zone. This was the beginning of a new counterinsurgency strategy called Plan Colombia. Next one, please. Plan Colombia was indeed a revolution for the counterinsurgency strategy of Colombia. With an investment of U.S. Colombia military cooperation of 9.3 billion US dollar from 2000 to 2014, at the national budget of taxes, it was possible, really possible, to deploy a sustained war strategy against the FARC. However, Plan Colombia resources at the beginning were restricted to the war on drugs. But after 9/11, and here we have again the influence of the international context in the Colombian conflict, Washington authorized Plan Colombia to be used against the FARC to fight the war on terrorism in Colombia, because the FARC was included as well in the list of terrorist organizations in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe as well. It was possible to execute precision bombing, centralized military operations. And we developed a new doctrine, a doctrine of joint operations that placed together all the efforts of the Army, of the Colombian Air Force, and also of the Navy. We were able to develop operations, 24-hour operations, because before Plan Colombia, that was not possible indeed. We started to use night vision capability for air power. Air power was really important for this counterinsurgency strategy, and also for ground troops. Night vision was really important to advance in the safe havens of the FARC. We integrated communications among all forces, all the military forces. We got better intelligence supported by the United States, satellite images, and also we had communication surveillance, and we acquired capabilities for air transport, so that allow us to reach any part of the country when the guerrilla was attacking, or even we developed a huge offensive against the guerrilla in their safe havens. Before of the Plan Colombia, that was not possible, and the military forces lasted even days to reach towns that were attacked by the guerrillas in depth. This was executed with 3 campaigns. The first one was called Plan Patriota, which was one of the biggest military operation, I think the biggest one after the fight for independence of the from the Spanish Empire. Uh, this operation, Plan Patriota, was executed in the south of the country, uh, specifically in Putumayo and Caquetá, the main safe haven of the FARC, and the place where they used to control the coca trafficking and the coca economy that gave them most of the resources to them. The second part of the plan is called Plan Consolidación, Consolidation Plan, which was supposed to bring the state to the rural places, and the state in an integral meaning. I mean by the integral meaning, public services such as health, such as education, and such as a justice system. And after that, there was developed Espada de Honor, Sword of Honor, 1, 2, and 3, which was meant to continue developing the offensive against the guerrilla. Next one, please. So what did happen after this? This strategy weakened the FARC resources and military capabilities of the FARC. It was the beginning of the end for them, the fall of the FARC. The FARC retreated to strategic rear guards and returned to guerrillas war tactics. That means small numbers of guerrilla combatants attacking infrastructure of the government or attacking military bases. That meant even crossing guerrilla fighters to safe havens beyond the borders. I mean by that developing guerrillas in Venezuela, but just as a safe haven for them. So they used to cross, and they are still doing that, crossing the border to attack Colombia and then return to Venezuela or even Ecuador. Main FARC leaders, thanks to Plan Colombia, were neutralized with air attacks in their safe haven. There was even an attack in Ecuador. That attack was called Operation Phoenix, and that attack was the beginning of the strategy to neutralize FARC leaders. There was a huge diplomatic problem with Ecuador due to that attack, but it was supported by the United States according to the doctrine of preemptive attacks. There was a steep decline of combatants in this period due to states' military effort. FARC passed from more than 20,000 combatants in 1998 to 8,000 in 2014 due to combat, air operations, and desertion of the ranks. It was possible also to reduce illegal economies by controlling coca areas and allocating integral state presence there. With the FARC destabilized and with the FARC's leadership inclined to negotiate, peace talks with Juan Manuel Santos' government were possible. Before of that, it wasn't possible because negotiations in El Caguán, according to Manuel Marulanda Vélez, were just a mean to relocate their forces and get more weapons and strength in this. It was a strategy, a military strategy to deploy the force and try to size the state by the arms. From 2012 to 2016, FARC and the Colombian government negotiated 6 points of a new peace agenda. These points were rural reform, political participation, the end of the illicit drug problem, victims and transitional justice, end of the conflict, implementation, verification, and ratification of the agreement. We are in that part in the implementation and ratification. It's been quite slow. That made of this agreement of the agreement that we have right now, quite a difficult problem for some guerrillas that decided to return to the fight because they were started to be killed by paramilitary groups, neo-paramilitary groups that belong to the drug trafficking. Uh, this has been quite a difficult problem to deal with. By 2016, guerrilla combatants demobilized with UN verification at 24 reincorporation zones. 13,000 members of FARC demobilized among combatants and members of their intelligence services. The FARC converted into a political party, which is called right now the Commoners or Comunes in Spanish. They accepted the rule of law and democratic principles. And as I told you, however, some combatants remained in the drug business, and some leaders took arms against the state or remained in illegality due to the slow implementation of the agreement in Colombia and due to economic interest rooted in the control of drug trafficking. For example, Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich, they escaped to Venezuela and started to found an organization that is called la Segunda Marquetalia, the second Marquetalia, as the true FARC for them. This was the end of a more than 50 years conflict with the oldest guerrilla in the continent. However, as I told you, full peace remains elusive, given the explosion of new violence in the country, where the FARC had presence and in Colombian border regions. And yeah, this was the end of the organization, but we are still having threats in the borders. There's an explosion of violence that is trying to control the Coca regions, and also the strategic paths to commercialize that drugs. There's even some organizations that are supported by Mexican cartels, which is quite a high threat for us. Criminals, transnational crime. It is a huge threat that was used in FARC, and it is still being used. And FARC dissidences divided in three elements. One element, which is independent movements. The other element, which is commanded by Gentil Duarte, which it is committing violence in the borders of Colombia and even in Venezuela, and the other part, which is supported by the Venezuelan government in Caracas, which is led by Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich. And next one, please. And okay, thanks a lot. This is the presentation. I hope that you are happy with it, and I'm open to some questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Javier Castrillon, for the very eye-opening presentation and great insights. I'm sure all of us very enjoying your presentation just now. So now we are moving on to the Q&A session. So in the meantime, let's give Mr. Javier time to catch a breath as we look and give space for participants to ask questions. Perhaps if you want to ask question, you can open your camera or unmute your mic. Alternatively, you can also put your questions in the chat box, so that Mr. Javier can address your question. All right. So first of all, Mr. Javier, a question from the moderator himself, myself. So I would like to ask, in regards to what you have explained earlier. So the coup d'etat, basically, of General Gustavo Rojas, which was ousted by the conservatives and liberals political parties. So I would like to know your view. What would be if General Gustavo Rojas didn't get ousted and continue his dictatorship? What would be happen differently for FARC if General Gustavo were to continue his presidency?
Well, that's a good question. Well, because basically that was a short dictatorship, one of the shortest one in the continent, because most of the dictatorships lasted more than 10 years, even 20 years. The one that lasted the more was, I think, the Bolivian one that lasted about 30 years or something like that. Anyway, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, he commanded the country for 4 years. He developed quite huge advances for Colombia. He even developed new airports. He developed new infrastructure, and he developed as well the national television in there, but he also had a quite a repressive side of the coin. He declared illegal communist movements. The Communist Party was declared illegal in that time as well, and he started to repress small movements of citizens that were demanding more rights for them. So basically, I think the story would be quite the same, because the National Front Agreement, it was a sort of autocratic uh, political way to lead the country, and an autocratic way of party indeed, because they alternated power every 4 years, 4 years for the conservative, 4 years for liberals, and it would be the same, a dictatorship of 4 years of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. If you put it in a dictatorship of 10 years, you will have basically uh, more violation of human rights, repression against the communist movement, and even some small liberal movements that were dissidents of the Liberal Party. And well, there's a quite uh, fundamentalist element in the military dictatorships, which is the order, the order to suppress everything that is against them. And even when the Liberal and Conservative Party ousted General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla from power, he tried to come back to power by participating in elections with his own movement inside the Liberal Party indeed. He didn't make it, and he founded the M19 years later, which is quite a nice change of military leader from a rightist to leftist movement by founding a guerrilla. So I will tell you this, if he continued commanding the country, we will have really similar elements in the history of Colombia, and maybe a fight between the military forces and the liberal and conservative movements, quite bigger civil war by that time.
Thank you so much, Javier, for the question, for the answer. I mean, okay, so I think any other participant would
Uh,
like to?
yeah,
Yes, yes,
thank
Brandon.
you so much for this interesting presentation. I have a question in regards for the illegal economies. You mentioned that after the peace treaty, the legal economy, or the cocaine or the coca trafficking was reduced. So does that mean that FARC has totally abandoned the 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 coca production? If so, what's the government stance on this?
Well, basically, after the peace agreement, uh, they abandoned the coca illegal economy indeed. That didn't reduce the illegal economy at all, because there were the ELN, there were drug traffickers, there were even Mexican cartels that started to intensify the coca harvesting in the Colombian regions, but the FARC participation in the business was reduced. Anyway, as I told you, uh, there were some dissidences that remain in the business. Most of those dissidences belonged to the financial organizations, to the financial part of the organization. So, well, the government was hoping to reduce the general market of drug trafficking, but indeed it grew because of negative incentives. And these negative incentives are the explosion of violence. You have an atomization of violence and groups in Colombia, those groups fighting and pressuring the population in rural areas to grow more plants. And also we have a negative incentive of the peace treaty, which one part of the peace treaty said that the government would allow certain quantity of money instead of eradicating coca crops. So basically, rural population started to grow more coca plants to have more money. That was a negative incentive, but the FARC participation in the business was reduced. But instead of that, you don't have a monopoly of one organization over the coca plantation, and when you have more participants in this business, basically you have more incentives, force incentives, and even money incentives to develop the business. So that's why there's right now an explosion of violence in Colombia, and the government is trying to control it with the help of the United States and by developing even more offensives and security initiatives in those regions. So the stand of the government, it is still fighting drug trafficking, because drug trafficking as a transnational crime, it is right now the main issue and the main resource for financing illegal groups.
Thank you so much, Ms. Javier, for the answer towards Majid's questions. Okay,
I have a question.
Yes, Sister Milton, go on.
All right, good evening, everyone, and good morning to Javier. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. My question is, what was the FRC strategy to convince the people to join the rebellion in the beginning?
Well, in the beginning, as I told you, there were quite huge structural problems in Colombia. There were huge poverty, huge inequality, and huge concentration of land. Those three elements were key elements in the speech and ideology of the FARC. So they used to found small guerrilla groups in isolated rural areas to defend the peasants against abusive landowners. So when you have an armed group with a social status, with the arms and with the financial resources to defend the rights of small peasants, they will join to the rebellion. Yeah, but that was at the beginning of the revolution, of the insurgency, before 1990. So that was quite attractive way to attract people and even young people to the revolution. But after 1991 and even more in the period of 1998 to 2002, 2005, they started to pressure the population to give the youngest, it doesn't matter men or women, the youngest children to the organization. And that's a crime, an international crime. And the FARC has a quite huge problem right now in the Colombian judicial system, and that crime is being dealt in transitional justice, which is allowed by the International Criminal Court. But if you see the history of FARC, you have those two periods. The first period, which they got legitimacy among rural population, and the second period, which they lost that popular legitimacy, and they basically pressured people to join to the FARC.
Thank you so much, Mr. Javier, for that answer. All right. Any other question from the floor?
Sorry again, I've got a question in regard.
Before that, Majid, I think it's the Professor Ishtiaq with us today.
Sure.
Would like to ask a question. Please be welcome, Professor Ishtiaq, if you have a question.
Okay, thank you very much, Javier, for a wonderful presentation. Very insightful indeed. I learned a lot. The kind of things that I didn't know about FARC. But I'm rather curious, you know, I mean, throughout your presentation, you never mentioned corruption in Colombia. I think this was one of the serious causes of every problem that Colombia has faced in the past and is currently facing. We know that. We all we have to do is to watch Narcos on Netflix, and we'll know the connections between Pablo Escobar. I know it's a movie, I know that, but the fact remains that, you know, certain parts of it are also maybe true. I mean, a society cannot exist with so much of corruption. My goodness, you can buy off anybody, literally. And of course, if one has to pay the price for that. My question is, why do you think that a revolutionary movement like FARC actually turned ultimately a band of kidnappers? And what else? They did everything. They did everything. They massacred villages after villages, right? In order to convince them to join them. That's not the way revolutionary movements work. In other parts of the world, even in South America, in other parts of South America. But why did they do that? I'm just curious. I've never found any answer, a proper answer. Maybe you can help me understand that. Can you please?
Yeah, of course. Well, as you said, corruption, it is one of the main problems of developing nations. And it is not different in Colombia, and basically inequality and concentration of land has kept almost the same as it was in the 1930s because of corruption. And of course, that even pressured people to take arms against the state in that. And we are still having plenty of corruption due to drug trafficking. And even the FARC used that corruption to develop certain experiments of government in isolated areas. They even pressured local governments to elect their own officers, their own guerrilla combatants, but not guerrilla combatants of the military part, but from their intelligence network to gain governmental resources. And with regard to the second part, basically, there's a researcher in Colombia which is called Oscar Palma. He is also from the London School of Economics, and he studied all that phenomenon. He called it the transformation of the FARC from an insurgency in all its name to a commercial insurgency. And a commercial insurgency, it is more interested in reaping gains from illegal economies. So basically, they developed massacres in order first to control illegal economies, to control people, because people in any civil conflict, like in the Colombian one, it is a resource. It is a resource of information. It is a resource of also of workers. It is a resource of combatants, and it is a resource of intelligence. If you threat enough the people in a territory where you are trying to get in, and is a territory in dispute with other groups, you have to develop huge levels of violence to control it. And that means committing massacres, committing kidnappings, and committing homicide against their leaders. So when you see FARC and their deployment through the territory, you see that the strategy. There's one part of the country, even more to the south of the country, where the FARC was even more allied to the population because they developed colonization processes, armed colonization processes, where they took different citizens of small towns uh, and they took them there to develop coca groves or even peasant economies. But there are some other parts, even more to the north of the country, where they arrive to those territories to fight with other guerrillas, for example, the ELN, or even fighting against the paramilitary groups, which they controlled the drug trafficking businesses. And their main reason to arrive there was controlling those illegal economies and assume strategic paths to commercialize it. And when you have that elements in a civil conflict, you have to control the population. And the way to control population, as I told you, it is committing massacres. It is threatening the population to defeat the other group and to gain the respect and social status and gain the control of the illegal economy in that territory. And they also massacre people that were suspected to help in the state. So that's why the FARC, you cannot see it just as a monolithic group, but a different kind of organization that develop strategies according to their interest in the territory and according to their opponents in the territory.
Thank you so much, Mr. Javier, for the great answer, and also thank you so much for Professor Ishtiaq's questions. All right, so first of all, before we proceed with another questions, is it okay, Mr. Javier, if we take another one or two questions? Or
Well, we're okay. I'm okay with two questions
okay.
more.
Okay, two questions more, right? So, okay, I'm going again to open the floor to any of the participants who interested to ask questions directly to Mr. Javier. Okay, I think I have a question from the conflict circle itself, so I'm going to ask on behalf of them. So, with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So I also read somewhere that there is a recruitment of young people by FARC dissidents after the COVID-19, and also how the Colombian government is affected in countering FARC because of the pandemic. So what do you think is the probable future outlook for FARC dissidents especially? Could they re-establish themselves financially or even in terms of militarily? Could they re-establish themselves?
Well, there's a huge fight between the dissident movements, even more with the border with Venezuela. It is a quite huge border of more than 2,000 kilometers. There's two huge dissidences that are fighting between them. The first one, it is commanded by Gentil Duarte, and the other one, it is commanded by Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich. They escaped to Venezuela, and they are receiving helping of Caracas. Yeah, they are receiving helping of Caracas, guns, weapons, uniforms, and even militaries of the Venezuela armed forces are helping them, and they are fighting each other. Even in Venezuela, you see some news from this side of the world right now. There's a huge fight in the state of Apure in Venezuela between the military forces of Venezuela that support Ivan Marquez and the front tent of Gentil Duarte. 1 year ago, there were a kind of negotiation between Gentil Duarte and Ivan Marquez to try to join and reform the FARC as we knew it. under the name of Second Marquetalia, the Segunda Marquetalia. But Gentil Duarte said, I'm not agree with that. I'm the supreme leader of this movement right now. And you basically were defeated first in the battleground against the state, and second in the political ground in the Havana Agreement. So that's why he's trying to develop again the organization in the country. He has about 2,000 combatants right now, Gentil Duarte, and Ivan Marquez, he has right now about 800 to 900 combatants. So basically, if the state doesn't take the measures, the adequate measures against this threat, we will have again a FARC, maybe not a FARC of 20,000 combatants as we had in 1998, but we will have a FARC of, let's say, 4,000 or 5,000 combatants threatening the state. But this plan, it is going to be quite difficult to develop in the short or the middle run, because they are not just fighting each other, they are fighting also the state, and they are fighting also the ELN and drug traffickers to try to control the illegal economies that grow in the regions, in the rural regions of Colombia and in the border of Colombia. And about the COVID-19 and the forced recruitment, the dynamic is still being the same in isolated areas, even though the state it is developing integral plans in those areas, in those parts. The problem is that even with the presence of the public force, the military forces there is still lack of public services and education. And on the top of that, when a guy belongs to an illegal group, that means social status, because they give them money, wage, and they give them weapons. And having weapons in an isolated area where the state does not make presence at all, that means social status for them, okay? So that is still been a problem for Colombia. And the element of COVID-19 is that it has confined population, and that confinement it is developed in some cases not just for the state, but for illegal groups like the FARC, like the ELN, like drug traffickers. If they do not comply with the confinement, they basically massacre the family. And we had cases of that in Nariño. So basically the population is surrounded by this group, and the population is loyal to the closest weapon that they have. If it's the state, they are loyal to the state. If it's the paramilitares, they are loyal to the paramilitares. If it's FARC, they are loyal to the FARC. So people, it is confined in these isolated conflict zones. And as I told you in an answer before, population, it is a resource for these organizations, okay?
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Javier. So moving on to the last question, I believe Sister Farah Nadia from the Coffee Circle has a question.
Hi, Ms.
Please
Javier. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. So my question is, did Plan Colombia in a way enhance and better equip the military capability of Colombia? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, Plan Colombia was a really important element in the new counterinsurgency strategy. They reinforced our air power mainly. We were able to reach any part of the country. You see, Colombia is divided by a cordillera and by a huge chain of mountains and jungles and rivers, where it is difficult to develop a fast strategy to counter the guerrilla attacks. So when we got the resources of Plan Colombia, we got helicopters, which is the main capability to move troops to the theater of operations. We got intelligence networks, and we got doctrine of joint operations between the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and you can even add the police, because the police here in Colombia, it is not a police in charge of civil duties. It is a police in charge of military duties due to the particular characteristics of the Colombian conflict. So those elements put it together, we were able to develop better intelligence networks in the rural areas. We were able to even develop kind of film operations where you have an intelligence service man going into the area of conflict, get the confidence of the group, of the guerrilla group, and put inside, for example, a pair of boots of a guerrilla leader, a beacon, yeah, a beacon that guided the troops and guided the bombs by GPS to bomb the camp of the guerrilla group, and that was the way in which we started to defeat the guerrilla leaders. And also, thanks to Plan Colombia, we developed a better air strategy to cut the paths of commercializing drug trafficking to Central America, and from Central America to North America. We, in 1999, had about, per year, about 600 traces of drug trafficking to North America, from Colombia or even Venezuela to Central America or any island in the Caribbean, and then to the United States. After Plan Colombia, we developed a quite huge strategy to counter that problem, and we passed from having 600 traces to have just 1 or 2 per year. So it was a huge element, Plan Colombia, not just for technology, but also for doctrine, but also for developing security sector reform that gave us better human capital to fill the forces and to fill the ranks and respect the human rights of population, and in that way gaining the legitimacy of the population, even though during the conflict the military forces made a lot of mistakes, but we were able to correct them and gaining not just the fight in the battleground, but also gaining the hearts of the people and legitimacy of the people, which is mainly important, which is really important in civil conflicts and when you have a counterinsurgency strategy. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Javier. That, wow, what a great discussion, I think. What a great presentation you gave, and what a better discussion that we have just now. I'm very sure that all of us are enjoying as well this very insightful um, discussion. So, okay, with the last question, it basically wraps up our session today. I would like, Conflict Circle would like to express our gratitude first and foremost to everyone who participated today. I'm sorry, participated today, and especially for Prof. Ishtia, our lecturer at the Political Science Department in IIUM. Thank you also for joining us tonight, uh, uh, and also especially thank you to Mr. Javier Castrillon for your willingness to join us tonight. And I think that's a very great insight that you have shared with us, and also by showing your impressive expertise throughout the discussion. So again, Conflict Circle would like to express our gratitude to Mr. Javier Castrillon. All right, so I would like to remind to the participants to fill in the form for attendance record, so that for IIM students, especially for your star points to be kicked in. So you can fill in the form provided in the chat box. So before we end the session today, I would like to initiate a photo shoot session for our conference today. So if possible, our participants, if possible, please open your camera as we will have a short photography session. Okay, I'll give a minute for everybody to get ready. All right. Okay.
I want to say thanks a lot to everyone. It is a pleasure to share with you the reality of Colombia and the reality of conflict that it's been a really bloody conflict that we have had, and we are still having with the, as I told you, with the ELN and other illegal armed actors in Colombia, even with the pressure of Venezuela, an autocratic government that is helping these groups, and they are developing like a kind of proxy war against us. And it is a pleasure. I hope to share with you more of my country in the future. And thanks everyone. This is an honor for me, and it is really nice to meet you in this academic space. And I hope to be part of the audiences next time, hearing the other presentations. It'll be really good for me as well. It doesn't matter the change of schedule for me. I'll be happy to be with you.
We'll be happy to have you as well, Mr. Javier. All right, so I think all of us are ready. I think Farah Nadia could take a screenshot of us, so I'll do the count. Or Farah will do the count?
give it. I can give
Okay.
the count.
All right.
1, 2, smile. 1 more. 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Farah Nadia, for the photography session. So with that, again, I would like to express our utmost gratitude to all who participated, and also Mr. Javier. So if you have any additional questions or would like to connect with Conflict Circle, please do not hesitate to contact us through our social media accounts or our email. So via Twitter or via our social media account on Twitter and Instagram. So thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night. Gracias a todos. Ciao.
Have
Bye.
a good breakfast with your family.
Gracias. Bye. Thank you.